Now, Jedi, you shall die. Unlimited power.
Greetings and thanks for joining Sloppy Zen. So this is our first recording of a distillation series, and the first book that we're going to do is this one, Zen Training by Katsuki Sekida. So this is a really good book on basically Zen practice, and just how to do it. Highly recommend it. What I'm going to be doing is diving into each chapter or each part of the book and getting into a distillation of the core messages in that chapter. In this case, in this one, we're just going to do the introduction. Some books, the introductions are, let's just say, superfluous. I wouldn't say that's the case with this book, and probably for a number of classic books. Although this one I wouldn't consider to be a classic in the traditional sense. This one was put out in the early 70s, and we'll go into that in a bit. So I've digested just the introduction for this first video, and let's get into a discussion about Zen training, methods, and philosophy. So Katsuki Sekida, who's the author of Zen Training, Methods, and Philosophy, he was born in 1893 in Japan. He wasn't a monk, but he was a layman. He retired as a school teacher in 1945. In 1963, he accepted an invitation to join a Zen group, and I believe that was in Honolulu, established by Robert Aiken, who has written a number of other books on Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion, and he's probably good. I believe he's a Zen master as well. Sekida stayed there until 1970. Now, he'd already started writing a book called An Introduction to Zen for Beginners, but that was in Japanese, and so Sekida sought to expand that book for an English version. And what happened was Sekida went to England, and he met the editor A.V. Grimstone there while he was visiting the London Zen Society. Now, in this text, the emphasis is on Zazen. And for those of you who don't know, you may be new to Zen, Zazen is the sitting meditation used in Zen. So when we're just sitting there, if our eyes closed, sometimes half open, just sitting there, focusing on the breath or koans, whatever, that is Zazen. And there's different methods. That is Zazen. At that time, when that was published, there were books all about Zen philosophy and things like that. But there was very little about the actual Zen meditation practice, Zazen, save for the 5 Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau. And I'd have to note that the 5 Pillars of Zen was my own introduction to Zen, and that was really an eye-opening experience. But in 1989, I had no idea how to really practice, and there was really only a nascent internet, so resources were kind of difficult to come by in Pittsburgh for Zazen, so I didn't really explore it any further than that. And it wasn't until like 10 years later where I still got into it. And so, the editor goes on, that was my digression there, but the editor goes on, say, Sekida provides a more scientific or why explanation as to things within Zen. So it may not be one of the more inspirational type of text. He doesn't use, on their end, he doesn't use a lot of exotic's the wrong word, esoteric language, language that's not familiar to those of us who are Occidental or those who are Western. He actually uses a bit of a scientific kind of explanation, and being of a little bit of a scientific bent myself, I think that's one of the reasons why I find it compelling. So I give kudos to him for doing that. Now, another thing that's different is that he doesn't view Kensho, which is another word for enlightenment or satori, as the aim of Zazen. For Sekida, the aim is to reach samadhi, which is a kind of state of stillness. Now, there's two kinds of samadhi, according to him. There's absolute samadhi, which is where the mind is a void, yet it is still awake. But there's also positive samadhi, where the mind is very much aware, but it's concentrated on a particular task or thing. I think that this is similar to a state called flow, which is described in a book by Mihaly. Now, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this gentleman's name right, and I apologize to him. Zazen Mihaly. Mihaly? Zen Mihaly. He has a book called Flow, and I think that positive samadhi is very similar to what he's describing. And I think pretty much everyone has experienced that at some time, maybe even, maybe in this day. So like you might be totally absorbed into a book, or even this video, or you could be cooking, or your work, or you're playing a video game. But here's the thing, Kensho, or enlightenment, requires you to enter absolute samadhi. So that must happen first. It's not conditional upon doing positive samadhi, which is, I want to say garden variety, but it's certainly pleasant for all of us to be in. And then in terms of enlightenment, or Kensho, there's varying depths of that Kensho a student could experience. Sekida emphasizes having a solid base of absolute samadhi, rather than the vanilla state of Kensho. So he'd rather you have, basically, he'd rather you reach that absolute state of samadhi. And I would say he wants you to repeat that repeatedly, rather than just like, okay, you've reached enlightenment, and then that's great. Problem can be that the effects of Kensho may not be that long lasting. And so another consideration the editor had was that there are Kensho-like experiences that you could have outside of Zen. So, for example, there are religious practices that have meditation. There are other religious practices that have meditation practices as a part of it. For some people, I wouldn't say necessarily most people even practice them, but they're there. And then you can also have Kensho-like experiences that could be induced through drugs, or you could have a condition of the brain like an epileptic seizure. So, for example, Dostoevsky described that in his books The Idiot and The Devils. Now, coincidentally, I have The Devils on my bookshelf as something to read, so I'm looking forward to what is described by the editor in the book as one of those experiences when I get a chance to dive into that. But the question raised is whether why would someone go through the rigors of Zen when there could be easier methods of achieving enlightenment, just like taking drugs? I wouldn't say that most people are going to want to have an epileptic seizure, but hey, you kind of get the picture. What's going on here is, the thing is, the goal, people are missing the target, perhaps. I think that's what the editor's saying. The goal is not enlightenment. It's not Kensho. It's repeated absolute samadhi. So samadhi, absolute samadhi over and over your mind. I would also argue that it's the case where it's not the end point that matters so much, but the journey itself. So a person who is traveling from Georgia to Maine by airplane is going to have a different experience than someone who did the exact same, but they hiked the entire route on the Appalachian Trail. It's going to be, they're going to have a different mindset. The brains are just going to be different just doing that. So the expression, it's not the destination, it's the journey, that's at play here. Also, Kensho may just be the start for a student. The student has to learn how to live in the regular world and not just a cloister of the mind while sitting on a cushion. Zen training happens all the time, not just when we're sitting in Zazen. So the key is, what Zen allows is for the student to live better in the real world. Another thing the editor found to be new is how Sekida described how the mind operates. Sekida called those operations of the mind something called nen. I might be mispronouncing, but it's kind of like a thought impulse. And there are 3 types of nen actions, which the editor found to be something new. He did find that Sekida's descriptions might not be up to snuff for an academic or a philosopher or a psychologist, but it would be good enough for people to show these mental phenomena for those who are just simply not familiar with it. So it's not poised in formal language that may be pleasing to academics. And in any event, if he did so, it would throw off the everyday reader or the Zen practitioner. Now, there's something I would have to note here with respect to this comment by the editor, that Sekida sometimes invokes the philosopher Husserl and the writer Proust. Now, quite frankly, I don't think that that would be something even most educated Westerners would be familiar with. Maybe in the 1970s things were different, but I don't think so. Nevertheless, you know, even that little quibble, he did look at things or provided parallels to things which a Westerner might find accessible, like football. Sekida brought a scientific approach to Zen. So, what I'm saying here is that Zen practice would yield properties that can be defined using science. Now, for some people, that scientific approach to Zazen may be discouraging. So if you're taking a romantic approach, you might not like this. And, you know, there could be some sort of bioengineering method to achieve similar kind of results with Zen. Well, the editor didn't really have an answer for that when he posed that question, but he said that Zen would not be diminished if its results could be defined in scientific terms. Quite frankly, Zen's nature is personal to the practitioner, and no matter how much you describe it or you analyze it or write it out, describe the states of it, reasoning, it's not the same as actually experiencing it. Also, the editor didn't answer the question whether the result of Zen could theoretically be accomplished through electronic devices, but simply noted that the results, basically, in what he considered the results to be, were the Zen masters that he encountered. They were not like cookie cutter people, but they were, in quote, entirely complete people. The question is raised, is like, well, we're born like this. So the editor asks, why do people need to go through Zen practice, a rigorous practice, or any other type of meditative practice, in order to really fully develop the mind? He says it's because we have an ego that keeps us from seeing reality. So we're trained to think of things like tools, and we treat everything, even people, like tools. So Zen involves stopping our ordinary thought process completely, where we enter absolute samadhi. Problem is language. When we use words, that is kind of like how we grasp the world, with words. But we have to surrender up that grasp. So through Zen, we can see the world as it is, rather than through the gauze of language. And so it's through this extended meditative practice that the features and architectures of the mind can be raised, which obscure the true reality. That editor also noted parallels in the writing of Iris Murdoch. He noted that Zen training is akin to what is viewed as moral effort by some Western writers and philosophers, and that to get to the correct moral decision, we need attention, so a focus directed at an individual's reality. So the editor's understanding is that even in the past, Zen students were not encouraged to examine the mental pathways in Zen. So that's in the East, let alone even in the West, or in the early 1970s when Zen training was written. So how could a Westerner, let alone a soul practitioner, have a guide to practice Zen? So Sekida decided he wanted to change that, and he used information from some other fields, and he uses those as analogies for how to practice Zen. And I mentioned earlier, for example, football might be something. And there's even the Western philosophies as well, since Westerners might be more familiar with those. This might be guideposts for them. And the editor reckons that this may have been the first time that these analogies have been used with the Zen practice book. And let's talk about in terms of the editing of the book itself. One final note from the introduction. In terms of the text itself, Robert Aiken actually did the first revision of the text itself, which I think was in a series of pamphlets. I think it might have been called the Diamond Sangha, probably for the Honolulu Sangha that Sekida initially went to. And so he did the first revision of the text, and then the editor A.V. Grimstone completed the revision, and he assembled it into its book form. But here's the key that I think we might find different from some other texts, is that Sekida wrote this text in English, probably a rarity at the time, and then he approved Grimstone's edit. So you can see that Sekida really, even in writing in English, targeted this to a Western audience at a time when Zen in America was not, I won't say as fully formed as it is now, as I would say it's fully formed yet, but certainly early in the 1970s. So that's it for my discussion from that was just the introduction to Zen Training, Methods and Philosophy by Katsuki Sekida. I hope you got some value out of it. I will be doing the entirety of the book. I hope to release these videos chapter by chapter as I fully digest and synthesize everything and distill it down to its core essence. So you might decide to get the book and enjoy it with me as we do it, or you may decide just to just listen to the video, whatever you decide to do. Maybe down the line I'll kind of condense all these together and put it out as a book on Amazon. You never know. But hopefully you found this distillation, even if just the introduction, useful and in your practice, or whether you're just interested in Zen. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again soon in the next installation or any of my other videos. Please click the like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more. And I hope you have a fantastic day. Take care.